been an uptick in interest lately in Sedevacantism because of Bergoglio. In the past 9 months or so, he has done so many outrageous things and said so many outrageous things that people are thinking a little bit more than they used to under Ratzinger and John Paul II. So I will present all of the forms of reaction to Vatican II and comment on them. I will explain the fundamental principles which guide our decision concerning how we react to Vatican II. And I will show Sedevacantism as the only viable Catholic solution. And I will answer objections to Sedevacantism. I will speak about opinionism, and I will speak about the Unicum Mass. So first, what are the principles? The fundamental question concerning all of our reaction to Vatican II is this: is the religion of Vatican II Roman Catholicism or not? When I say the religion, I mean the ensemble of doctrines, disciplines, and liturgical practices. Those are the three essential aspects of religion, any religion. Are those three things taken together, the entire ensemble, do they, taken together, represent and consist of Roman Catholicism? Is it Catholic or not? And there is a yes or no answer to that question. The answer that we give to that question will determine everything else that we think or do about the problem of Vatican II. And it's very important to situate yourself in that regard concerning that question. Usually, the way that we go is by a reaction to the new Mass. The traditional movement was born out of a reaction to the new Mass. But the Mass and liturgical practices of the Church are what we might say, the face of the Church. But they do not constitute the foundation of the Church. Doctrine does. And if we remain simply on the level of reacting to a Mass that we don't like, that we find something wrong with, but never getting down to the fundamentals, we are going to make errors. Because that is simply, essentially, a gut reaction. I don't like this. This doesn't speak to me as Catholicism or as a Catholic Mass. I don't like it. I want the traditional Latin Mass. That's usually the root of someone who is reacting to Vatican II. It's not wrong, but it is insufficient. Now, no one challenges that there have been changes in the Church as a result of Vatican II. Every single person in the world would agree with that statement. Now, let us look at the changes of Vatican II. Principally, they are ecumenism. That is at the real bottom of Vatican II. Vatican II was called to consecrate ecumenism. And from ecumenism came various other errors, such as religious liberty, such as a new conception of the Catholic Church, and collegiality, in order to conform the Catholic Church to the Greek Orthodox way of doing things. It all comes back to ecumenism, and even ecumenism has a more fundamental principle to it, and that is relativism of truth. Modernism destroys the Catholic notion of absolute truth. The absolute truth of the Catholic Church prevents the Catholic Church from being ecumenical. But once you destroy the absoluteness of Catholic dogma, then the door is open to ecumenism, which was condemned in 1928 by Pope Pius XI. And so there have been many, many liturgical changes, many, many disciplinary changes. I'm sure all of you are familiar with those. I don't have to go over those. There is a whole new face of Catholicism today in comparison to what it was in 1958 when Pius XII died. You would not recognize the Church of 1958 and of today as being the same religion or the same church. So the question is, are these changes of Vatican II substantial or accidental? That is, have these changes gotten into the substance of the Catholic Church, the very essence of the Catholic Church, her doctrines, her liturgy, her disciplines? Or are they merely accidental, something like changing the color of the walls in your room? And there is nothing in between substantial and accidental. Any change that occurs in nature is either substantial or accidental. If I burn something up, that's a substantial change. If I paint it a different color, that's an accidental change. There's nothing in between. So these changes of Vatican II are either substantial or they are accidental. Another principle we must understand is that the Church can never change substantially. She is indefectible. It is impossible that there be a substantial change of the Catholic Church. If it happens, it means you have a defected church. However, another principle is that the Church is subject to accidental change. The Church does not say Mass, if we look at the traditional Mass, in exactly the same way today as it did at the time of the 1st century AD. It was somewhat different. Even at the time of St. Gregory, it was slightly different. The offertory was brought in during the early Middle Ages from the Gallican Rite, for example. St. Pius V added certain things to the Mass. He brought the prayers of the foot of the altar into the Mass from the sacristy. He added the last Gospel. So the Catholic Church has always been subject to substantial change. Look at the accidental change. You look at the Eastern rites. They are accidentally different from the Roman Rite, yet they are substantially the same worship. So that question of substantial or accidental change is capital, because if Vatican II merely represents accidental change, then we must accept it. And the traditional movement has no reason or purpose for existence. If it is merely accidental, we may not like it, but if it is merely accidental change, we cannot oppose it on any solid ground. It might be better or worse, you could say. It might be less expressive than the traditional rite or the traditional way of presenting doctrines. It might be more expressive, but if it is accidental, it doesn't affect the substance of the Catholic Church. Another question to ask concerning the Novus Ordo is, can I save my soul by practicing the Novus Ordo religion? If I go to the church that Bergoglio wants me to go to, my local parish church, and I practice there the Mass and the sacraments and everything that he prescribes for me, is that the path to salvation? Is that pleasing to God? Can I save my soul in that environment? Is the Novus Ordo, and by that I mean the whole ensemble of doctrine and practices and liturgical practices, is that pleasing to God? Is the Novus Ordo pleasing to God? Or not? There's a yes or no answer to that. Those questions must be answered before you can go anywhere with regard to deciding what to do about it. Soon, John Paul II is going to be canonized. This means that a man who made it his life's work to promulgate Vatican II and who participated in liturgical abominations against the First Commandment in the name of Vatican II, namely Assisi, that he is going to be canonized. that means that not only can you save your soul in the Novus Ordo, but you can become a saint by promulgating the Novus Ordo. That's going to be a big problem for the Society of St. Pius X. If he's a saint, and he promulgated the Novus Ordo and participated in all of these ecumenical acts, then how do they stand? If you can go to heaven and be a saint by doing that, then what is the purpose of the SSPX? So the answer to the question will determine the Catholic response to Vatican II. Is Vatican II Catholicism or not? The answer to that question will determine our response. There is a yes or no answer as to whether Vatican II is Catholic or not. There is no gray. There is nothing in between those two things. If the answer is yes, it is Catholicism, then we must accept Vatican II. If it is no, then we must utterly reject it. There is no gray between those two things. There is no middle ground. Either it is accidental change or it is substantial change. There is no middle ground between those two things. It is like a fork in the road. If we say yes, it is Catholicism, then the proper attitude toward Vatican II is to accept it. Submit to the authority of the Church. If the new Mass offends our sensibilities, then we can seek the motu proprio Mass. We can say to the proper authorities that we would prefer the traditional Mass, and they might give us the traditional Mass in place. That's what they have done by the motu proprio. That would be still a Catholic response, that we're saying Vatican II is all correct, the new Mass is correct, everything is in order. It's just that our sensibilities prefer this. That is essentially the position of all of the religious congregations that adhere to the motu proprio or who have some sort of indult or permission to use the traditional Mass, like Christ the King and Fraternity of St. Peter, others too. If the answer is no, it is not Catholicism, Vatican II is not Catholicism, then we must reject Vatican II and all of its reforms in the same manner as the Church rejected heresies in the past. Then we are in the same position as Catholics in the 16th century. We must reject it so fundamentally and so firmly that we have to be willing to die rather than to participate in any way in this substantial distortion of Roman Catholicism. There is no middle ground between those two positions, because it either is Catholicism or it isn't. Another important principle to understand is that it is impossible that the authority of the Catholic Church promulgate to the whole Church false doctrines, evil disciplines, and false liturgical practices. This is the guarantee of Christ to the Catholic Church. Whatever thou shalt bind upon earth shall be bound also in heaven. If this were not true, then the Church could and would defect in her essential mission, which is the salvation of souls. If the Church universally could give to the whole world something that is displeasing to God, false worship, false doctrines, evil disciplines, then it becomes nothing better than the Church of England or any other religious body that has no guarantee or assistance from God. It really should not exist. It has no purpose. We would be better trying to figure out our own religion in such a case than to be led by something that could lead us to hell. Hence, if we take the position that Vatican II is a substantial change of the Catholic faith, we must necessarily conclude that it cannot come from the authority of the Church, because it is a universal teaching. It has made universal practices. It has established universal practices and universal liturgical observances for the whole Church. If these things are substantial changes of the Catholic faith, we must necessarily conclude that it cannot come from the authority of the Church. Why is this so? Because the authority of the Church is the authority of Christ. Pope Pius XII said it in Mystici Corporis, that the authority, the power of the Pope, is the same as the authority of Christ. There are not two heads in the sense of two different authorities. There is the invisible head, Christ, and the visible head, the Pope. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. They both have the same authority. So the authority of the Pope is the same as the authority of Christ. So we would be obliged to say that this distortion, this defection, this substantial change has come down from the authority of Christ, which is blasphemy, if we take the position that Vatican II is a distortion of the Catholic faith, a substantial distortion of the Catholic faith, yet it comes from the authority of the Church. We would be obliged to place it right into the will of Christ, that the will of Christ is that we accept a substantial distortion of the Catholic faith. That is blasphemy. So we know that we can't go there. Hence, the position that Vatican II is not Catholic necessarily requires that we say that the perpetrators of Vatican II do not bear the authority of Christ. It follows logically and necessarily. Hence, Sedevacantism. Sedevacantism does not argue principally from the personal heresies of Bergoglio or Ratzinger or anybody else. It argues principally from Vatican II and what the modernists have done to Vatican II. Is it Catholicism or not? Does it come, if it is not Catholicism, it cannot come from the authority of the Church. Therefore, by strict logic, those people who claim to be the authority are not the authority of the Church. Despite whatever appearances they have or anything else they may have, they are not the authority of the Church. Now, those are the general principles of ecclesiology, and this is the teaching of the Church and of theologians concerning the very nature of the Catholic Church. That is the major premise of the syllogism that I'm going to give you today. The minor premise is, but Vatican II is substantial change. So we're saying, as the first general principle, if it is substantial change, then those who have perpetrated it cannot be the authority of the Catholic Church. But Vatican II is substantial change. Look at ecumenism, which is condemned by Pope Pius XI. Look at religious liberty, condemned by Pope Pius IX. The new ecclesiology that has been condemned by very many popes. The collegiality, which was condemned in the 18th century. Look at the new Mass, the new disciplines, all of the things that are permitted that are mortal sins in the traditional books of the Church, such as Communicatio in Sacris, where non-Catholics can receive Catholic communion and Catholics can receive non-Catholic communion. That's considered mortal sin. You look up any moral theology book, it's a mortal sin of confusion of religions. The loss of the marks of the Catholic Church. Where is the unity of faith? If you look at polls, most people do not believe that Christ is present in the Holy Eucharist. They do not believe in transubstantiation. All of the polls that you see, they are nearly all the same. Many other dogmas are denied. For example, artificial birth control, that it is wrong, is denied by most people that call themselves Catholics. They believe that it is perfectly correct. Many other moral issues are denied by people who call themselves Catholics, and nothing happens. There is absolutely a dogmatic chaos in what purports to be Roman Catholicism today. Chaos. There is no unity of faith. There is no holiness. Where is the holiness of Catholicism in what we call the Novus Ordo? There is no Catholicity because there is no unity. You have to have unity of faith in order to have Catholicity, because Catholicity is one faith that is communicated to many. And you don't have the unity of government in as much as what is done is not done, it cannot be done in the name of Christ. It is not the true government of the Catholic Church. The only thing that you can grant them is a certain organizational and administrative unity that you could grant to General Motors or to any other organization in the world. So, again, I could spend a great deal of time on that very point, that it is a substantial change. But I want to give you simply the essentials in this talk and to guide you in how to resolve these problems. Hence, we must conclude necessarily to Sedevacantism. If we are saying that Vatican II is substantial change, we must conclude necessarily to Sedevacantism. Now, what are the three positions of reaction to Vatican II? The first is that Vatican II and its changes, the reforms, everything that you know as the Novus Ordo and the whole gamut, is essentially orthodox. It may not be ideal, but it is essentially orthodox. That is the position of indult people who have followed the indult and then the motu proprio mass, the Fraternity of St. Peter and others. We accept Vatican II, they say. We accept it perhaps reluctantly. We accept all the reforms perhaps reluctantly, but we want our niche of traditional liturgical practice within this great Vatican II structure. That's the first way of reacting to it. The second is to say Vatican II is not orthodox. It is substantial defection from Catholicism. Therefore, it must be rejected, and with it, the legitimacy of its hierarchy, as we already pointed out. Then there is a third way, and that is of the Society of St. Pius X, which says that Vatican II is bad. It never really answers the question of whether it is substantial defection from Catholicism or not, but that it is bad, so we reject what we think is bad and accept what we think is good. At the same time, we launch a worldwide apostolate in defiance of the persons that we say constitute the Roman Catholic hierarchy, that is, Bergoglio and all of the bishops in union with him. So they consecrate bishops, they ordain priests, they set up parishes and schools and convents and religious orders, as if the Pope doesn't exist. And the only thing that they do is put a picture of the Novus Ordo Pope in the front of their churches. And they put his name in the canon, and this is their way of saying we recognize him as the Pope. Now, numbers 1 and 2, that Vatican II is essentially orthodox, that's number 1. Number 2 is Vatican II is unorthodox, are at least consistent with the principles of Catholicism. Because you have that fork in the road. Vatican II is substantially Catholic. Vatican II is not substantially Catholic. That's the fork in the road. If it is substantially Catholic, then there is a certain logic that flows from that. If it is not substantially Catholic, there is a logic that flows from that. So 1 and 2 are at least logically consistent. So the Fraternity of St. Peter, although I would disagree with their position, because I do not agree that Vatican II is substantially Catholic, I would say are at least consistent, that they follow Catholic principles of determining what to do about the problem. They are logical. It makes sense if you admit the orthodoxy of Vatican II. Hence, Sedevacantism is consistent and logical if you say Vatican II is not orthodox, is not Catholicism. As we have seen, it necessarily concludes to the fact that it is impossible that it proceed from the authority of the Catholic Church. So those two lines have consistency and logic in their favor. Number 3, the SSPX is an impossible solution for these reasons. First of all, the act of mounting a worldwide apostolate against the Novus Ordo hierarchy argues that the Novus Ordo is intrinsically evil and that one cannot save his soul in it. Why else would you do that? Why would you set up churches and seminaries and try to attract people away from the Mass and the sacraments and the priests that Bergoglio has sent out? Except that you cannot save your soul in those churches. If we can save our soul in those Novus Ordo churches, why don't we just go? Why is the traditional Mass or the traditional movement necessary if we can go to heaven, just as John Paul II supposedly did, by embracing the Novus Ordo? That's the ultimate end of what we do, is to go to heaven. If we can go to heaven that way, let's go. But to establish such an elaborate apostolate is to say implicitly that you cannot save your soul in that. But if you cannot save your soul in it, that argues necessarily to Sedevacantism. Because, as I said, it is impossible that the authority of Christ promulgate to the whole church something that leads you to hell. It's like the airplane to hell. That's inconceivable, that the authority of Christ would put you on the airplane to hell. So to make that statement implicitly, what they do so by what they do, they're making the statement that the Novus Ordo is something in which you cannot save your soul. It concludes necessarily to Sedevacantism. But at the same time, they profess to be, this is the SSPX, professes to be in communion with the Novus Ordo hierarchy and professes to seek to be recognized by it and to work with it. They have done this since the beginning. The SSPX was founded in 1970 as a Novus Ordo congregation. Actually, it wasn't even a congregation, a pious union in the Diocese of Fribourg in Switzerland. It had a license to exist from the Novus Ordo. It was suppressed by the Novus Ordo in 1974, and ever since they have sought to regain their recognition by the Novus Ordo hierarchy. And they have not stopped. They have not repudiated the idea of being recognized and working with the Novus Ordo hierarchy. And so, what is the Novus Ordo for that? Is it Catholicism or not? And by some of the things they say and do, you would conclude that it is not Catholicism. By some of the things they say and do, you would conclude it is Catholicism. They also say that they are with the Pope. This is impossible since the Pope is not with them. If John says he's with Mary, it is necessary that Mary be with John. You cannot be with somebody unless that person is standing next to you. So they cannot say, I am with the Pope, when the Pope says you're a schismatic sect. I have nothing to do with you. That's simply a false statement to say they are with the Pope. They are not with the Pope because the Pope is not with them, and he is the principal in that relationship. He's the one that holds all the power. He is the one that is the source of Catholic communion, if he is the Pope. So it is far more important that he be with them than that they be with him. He is not with them. Therefore, they're out on their own. And the placing of a picture in the vestibule of the church, or the naming of him in the canon of the Mass, doesn't do anything for that essential relationship that is missing, namely that you are approved by the Roman Pontiff. Because the Society of St. Pius X position is impossible, it cannot be pleasing to God. Something cannot be pleasing to God if it is against reason. Reason is our connection to morality. Whatever is moral is connected to God's will by reason. If it is unreasonable, it cannot possibly be in accordance with God's will. All moral theology is based on that. The connection of what you do to right reason based on the authority, on principles that are revealed by God, the Ten Commandments and other things. So it is impossible to please God by saying, on the one hand, that, well, the Novus Ordo is bad and we must fight against it and draw people away from it, and that people cannot save their souls in it. And on the other hand, to say we want to work with it and be approved by it. That is, none of that makes any sense, and therefore it cannot be pleasing to God. To recognize Bergoglio or any of these Novus Ordo popes as pope is to hand him Roman Catholicism. In the end, they will be the victor. If they are true Roman Catholic popes, then you are saying that they represent doctrinal and liturgical continuity, because it is impossible that a Roman Catholic pope not continue the integrity of Catholic faith, practice, and liturgy. It is impossible. He is the norm of all of those things. So if you hand him the papacy, you hand him authentic Roman Catholicism in the long term. Historically, you hand it to him. But if Catholics say no, those persons are not true Roman Catholic popes, then they are stripped of any possible continuity, because you're saying essentially, if you are not upholding Catholic dogma, Catholic liturgy, Catholic practice, it is impossible that you be the Roman Pontiff. Then they have nothing to stand on. It is a statement in history that because they were discontinuous, because they did not have continuity, therefore true Catholics rejected them. Just as in history, the true Catholics of this nation, England, had rejected the new religion. And now we see them as great heroes, because even though they were under tremendous pressure, both by enticements and by threats, to accept the new religion of Henry VIII and all of the people that came after him, they resisted and made a statement to history that the Catholic Church cannot be altered. The Catholic faith must remain the same. And so also we must say that, and the means by which we do that is to say, this person who claims to be the Pope, even if he should have a valid election, cannot be a true Roman Catholic Pope because he has broken from Catholic doctrine. St. Paul said, if I, or an angel from heaven, should come down and preach to you a gospel that I have not preached to you, let him be anathema. Galatians chapter 1, verse 7. And then he repeats it. He says it twice to the Galatians in the same chapter. If I, or an angel from heaven. And that's what Catholics must say to this Novus Ordo hierarchy if it is a substantial change from Roman Catholicism. The Pope has a gravitational pull on every Catholic, just as the Earth pulls on the moon and pulls on satellites. Eventually, those satellites return to Earth. And that is true of anyone that regards that Novus Ordo hierarchy as the Catholic hierarchy. They will eventually go back with the Novus Ordo, and the whole battle of the Catholic faith will be lost in them. It is impossible to stay away from the Roman Pontiff if you are a Catholic. Catholics are defined by their submission to the Roman Pontiff. It enters into the definition of a Catholic to be submitted to the Roman Pontiff. You cannot call yourself a Catholic unless you are submitted to the Roman Pontiff. And therefore, to carry on a worldwide apostolate in defiance of the Roman Pontiff is contrary to being submitted to him. Now, that said, what are some objections to Sedevacantism? The first is we cannot judge the Pope. This is a classic case of what is known as begging the question. The question is this man the Pope or not? So you cannot come in with the argument, well, we can't judge the Pope. Because that's what we're trying to ask, whether he is the Pope or not. So that's known as begging the question, so that we just set that aside. Another objection is the Pope is only a material heretic. First of all, I would respond that we're not really talking about his personal heresies here. We're talking about Vatican II and its reforms. The personal heresies of each of these men, and they exist, also argue to their being non-popes. But that is not the principal argument of Sedevacantism, that he said this, or he said that, or he did this. It all goes back to Vatican II. What is Vatican II? What are its reforms? That's the first thing I would answer. The second thing is that the only way in which you could pronounce a heresy and not be guilty, that is, not be a formal heretic, is by ignorance. So if a farmer who can't read or write says there are 4 persons in the Trinity, anybody in his right mind would say, well, he doesn't know, he's never been instructed, the poor man just doesn't know. He's a material heretic. That does not corrupt the virtue of faith if through ignorance you do not know. Are we going to say for one moment that a person like Ratzinger is ignorant? That he doesn't know Catholic doctrine? That he was born in the 1920s, raised as a Catholic? Or Bergoglio, born in the 1930s, raised as a Catholic in a very pious Italian family? That he doesn't know Catholic doctrine? He said, for example, I do not believe, and this is a quotation, I do not believe in a Catholic God. There is no Catholic God. That's a quotation from Bergoglio in that interview with that atheist. It's a quotation. There is no Catholic God. Can you say that? Can anyone say that without destroying the virtue of faith in you? That means the object of the creed of the Catholic Church that we recite, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Athanasian Creed, all of the creeds of the Catholic Church, that what is described as the true God doesn't exist. So the argument that he's only a material heretic is, I would respond, absurd, because it is absurd to say that someone like Ratzinger or Wojtyła or Bergoglio does not know the Catholic faith. That is absurd. Another objection to Sedevacantism is only the Church can declare him a non-pope. My response to that is only the Church can take away from him an election, but it is not true to say that only the Church can declare him a non-pope. In other words, we have no authority to declare anybody anything. We are not judges. We are not ecclesiastical judges. However, we do have the right and the obligation, from what St. Paul says, to consider non-Catholic somebody who is giving to us a false religion. Now again, this goes back to saying Vatican II is substantial distortion. If he is feeding us a false religion, it is impossible that he have the authority to teach, rule, and sanctify the Church. So I would give you an example. If you live next door to someone whom you knew was a child abuser, would you say, well, there's been no declaration. The law has not caught up with him. Therefore, I will send my children over to play at his house. No one in his right mind would do such a thing. Because you would say, I know that that person is a child abuser, and I could not possibly let my children play over there. In other words, he is clearly guilty of the crime. No one would for example, the shooter in the Colorado theater is clearly guilty of the crime. There is no doubt that that man did that. He's clearly guilty. He has to go through the process, yes, the judicial process, but he's clearly guilty. No sane person would say that man is not the one that did it. So also these Vatican II popes are clearly guilty of crimes against the Catholic faith. And we have already seen that they cannot be merely materially guilty, but because of their knowledge, must be formally guilty. There is a question about the sanity of that Colorado shooter, and they may put him in an insane asylum for the rest of his life because he's only materially guilty. That may be determined, but there's no room for that with regard to these Vatican II popes. And you could put the same argument that they say only the Church can declare him to be a non-pope. Well, then why do we reject the new Mass? Why do we reject the Council? The Church has never condemned the new Mass. The Church has never condemned the Council. Why do we reject those things out of hand without any declaration of the Church? So the rejection of the new Mass and the rejection of the Council necessarily implies the rejection of the Novus Ordo hierarchy without declaration. If you're going to wait for a declaration, you should put on your clown suit, blow up your balloons, and go to the Novus Ordo. Another objection to Sedevacantism is he's like our father, he's a bad father, but even if we have a bad father, he nevertheless remains our father. This is an argument from analogy, and the analogy is bad, because a father is always a father, no matter what he does, because of physical generation. But a man who comes to the papacy is a pope by, not by physical generation, but by a relationship that is generated by authority. And so he can lose that authority, as we know from canon law. He may never gain that authority because he intends to impose a false religion. So the analogy is not there. But furthermore, I would argue that if a father is abusive to his children, the state will come and take the authority away from the father. Even though he continues to be the father, he has no authority. And and so I would also add that. But in any case, it is not a good analogy because the authority of the Roman pontiff is something that is able to be lost through various means and reasons. Another objection is that he is a bad pope, and we've had bad popes in the past. This is not a very forceful objection because we have never had any bad pope that has changed the Catholic religion. So it really skirts the whole issue. Is Vatican II Catholicism or not? I mean, if he were upholding the Catholic faith, we wouldn't really care if he were immoral. Well, I shouldn't say that. It would not affect our faith if he were immoral. We would deplore his immorality, but it would not affect our faith. We could still go to our local churches. We would pray that he die, perhaps, but that it would not affect our faith. This affects our faith. And so the analogy, again, of comparing him to Alexander VI, the various other immoral popes, doesn't hold. We've never had a precedent of this, where someone who claims to be the Roman pontiff is actually giving us false doctrine. Another objection is the visibility of the church. If you take away the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, you have no visibility of the Catholic Church. I would respond that your argument doesn't do anything for visibility, because a pile of dung is very visible, but it is not Roman Catholicism. And if you're saying that again, it goes back to the original argument, if this is a defection from Roman Catholicism, then what is visible to you is a pile of dung. It is not the Roman Catholic hierarchy. It is not Catholic doctrine and Catholic practice. It is a pile of dung. That's plenty visible, but it doesn't help you to bring that up as an argument against Sedevacantism. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I would say there is visibility for various other reasons, the practice of Catholics who are resisting and who practice publicly. They are visible to the whole world. Everybody knows about traditional Catholics. It's not like it is a secret society or anything like that. This is what we're doing today. So there is visibility, but that's really, I want to keep to essentials here, and I would do that at another time. And another objection is, where do we get a pope? And that if the hierarchy is all defected, we cannot come up with a pope. And here I would give as the response the thesis of Bishop Gerard de Laurier, that you still have the ability to obtain a pope, because although these Novus Ordo popes do not have authority, yet they are in possession of legitimate elections, and the Novus Ordo can still elect people validly to the position in which they could accept the authority and receive the authority. That, again, is another lecture that would take me a long time, but I don't want to get into it here. I will talk next about opinionism. There are a lot of priests, especially in the Society of St. Pius X, who are opinionists concerning the issue of the Roman pontiff. Now, we already saw that if you take the position that the Novus Ordo is a substantial distortion of Roman Catholicism, that it necessarily concludes to Sedevacantism. Therefore, that logic already excludes opinionism. To have an opinion is to say, well, I think A is true, but I'm not sure entirely B, its opposite, may also be true. See, so the mind is not fixed on what you believe to be true. You think, well, this is probably or possibly true, but its opposite may also be true. That is an opinion. And it is not possible to go by opinion on this question, and I'll tell you why. Submission to the Roman pontiff is necessary for salvation. That is defined, that is a defined dogma by Boniface VIII. If you are not subject to the Roman Pontiff, you cannot go to heaven. And as I said, the Catholic is defined by his submission to the Roman Pontiff. You cannot be a Catholic unless you are submitted to the Roman Pontiff. And therefore, the Catholic is defined by his rejection of a false pope. If he is defined by his submission to a true pope, he is also by the same token defined by his rejection of a false pope. If when Pius XII died, in that interregnum, if there was one, or in the present interregnum, or let's say just any ordinary pope dies, in that 2 or 3 weeks where there is no pope, if you recognized some false pope, you would cease to be Catholic. Because every Catholic must be a Sedevacantist when the pope dies. In order to remain Catholic, he must say there is no pope at the present time. So as much as he is defined by submission to a reigning pope, he is defined by his rejection of false popes if there is no reigning pope. Very important point. For this reason, probabilism or opinionism cannot be used, because you cannot use probable opinions and arguments in something that relates to and pertains to your eternal salvation. You must somehow resolve that doubt. You can't say, well, walk into a church, this is probably a Catholic church. See? You have to resolve it and say, well, I see signs in which this is a Catholic church. Or you can't just posit some act that is possibly a mortal sin by saying, well, in my opinion, this is true. You must somehow resolve the doubt. And the only thing that justifies an organized resistance and denunciation of the Novus Ordo is the certitude that it is a substantial change. Certitude. Why is this so? Because these men that have proposed these changes to us have come up through the ranks of the hierarchy, have been elected by all intents and purposes and by all appearances to the papacy. That gives them the benefit of doubt. Because in resolving a doubt, authority, at least apparent authority, has the right to the benefit of the doubt. So if you said, I don't know if Vatican II is okay or not, I don't know if it's defection or not, if he is the Roman Pontiff, you must say, well, he has the benefit of the doubt. You cannot oppose him on a mere doubt or a probable idea. The only way that you can legitimately oppose him is on certitude that he is denying the Catholic faith and giving you something that is contrary to Catholic teaching. Certitude. Otherwise, you are in serious trouble, and you're like a Protestant, where you're putting up your own judgment against what is apparently the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Sedevacantism, therefore, necessarily flows from substantial change, as we said. Therefore, to make Sedevacantism an opinion is to make substantial change an opinion. Therefore, you're saying, well, maybe Vatican II is okay. Maybe the whole reform is legitimate and Catholic. If you're saying that, well, possibly he is the Pope. What I'm saying is that Sedevacantism is so necessarily tied to the statement that Vatican II constitutes an essential change, a substantial change of Roman Catholicism. That to be an opinionist concerning the identity of the Roman Pontiff is to be an opinionist concerning the defection of Vatican II from the Catholic faith. And to base your eternal salvation on an opinion that you might have, well, in my opinion, it's not something that is in conformity with the Catholic faith, is to be a Protestant. It is to oppose your own thoughts to the authority of the Roman Pontiff. You have to be absolutely sure that the religion that is coming down is opposed to the previous teaching and practice of the Catholic Church. You have to be certain of that in order to act morally. So opinionism is something that doesn't have a place here. You can have an opinion of how efficacious grace works, and the Dominicans and the Jesuits have had their opinions for many centuries, and they're very much opposed on it. That's where you can have opinion in the Catholic Church. You cannot have opinion about whether Vatican II is substantially Catholic or not. That's not a matter of opinion. You're basing your whole eternal salvation on it. And then we go to the problem of the unicum Mass. To name a pope or the local bishop in the canon is to do two things. One, it is to declare that he is the pope, truly the pope. And two, it is to declare that you are offering the Mass with that pope. Now you see the problem. That if you are saying Vatican II is substantial change, you're necessarily tied logically to Sedevacantism. You are defined as a Catholic by your rejection of these false popes, just as you are defined as a Catholic by your submission to a true pope. How can you drag his name into the central act of worship and say, this man is the Pope, in the central act of worship, in the canon itself, in which the body and blood of Christ is consecrated? It is a lie. It is a lie in the very heart of the Catholic Mass, if that man is not the Pope. Furthermore, it means that you are offering the Mass with Bergoglio. Because Bergoglio is, in that case, the Pope, he is the high priest. That means that the ordinary priest at the altar is submitted to his act of worship, because no one is more suited to offering the holy sacrifice than the high priest of the Catholic Church, namely the Roman Pontiff. Because every Mass is an act of the whole Church. And therefore the Pope, in a certain sense, offers every Mass, just as Christ the priest offers every Mass. The vicar of Christ, in that sense, also offers every Mass, and that's why his name is there. We offer this Mass in union with, together with, as if he were standing right there. And that, too, is offensive to God. The offering of Cain was turned down because it was offered by somebody who could not offer. Had nothing to do with the offering. But it was the offering of Cain. If he has his hands on the chalice and on the paten, then it is something offensive to God. He is alien to the Catholic Church. Again, if Vatican II is substantial change. He has no place in the Mass. And traditionally, that has always been considered a sign of communion with the Roman Pontiff, that name in the canon. And Roman Pontiffs have insisted that schismatics, when they are coming back to the true Church, that they place the name of the Roman Pontiff in the canon. So it is a type of test of communion, manifestation of ecclesiastical communion. If he is not the true Roman Pontiff, he does not belong in that Mass, and you must not be at that Mass. For you cannot say, well, I exempt myself from what he's doing. You can't do that because you offer your Mass through the priest of the altar. I'll give you an example. It would be like getting on an airplane willingly and not consenting to where the pilot is going. Imagine if you got up in the aisle and said, I have gotten on this plane willingly, but I do not consent to the destination of this airplane. People would say, you're crazy, you're out of your mind, you're mad. The same is true if you go to an unicum mass and say, well, I don't agree with what the priest is doing. Essentially, it's the same thing. You're there willingly, therefore you consent to what he's doing. And you cannot offer mass or offer your sacrifice outside of him or apart from him. You are doing what he is doing, just as you are going where the pilot is going. So if you hold that he is not the Pope, then it is a lie to assert that he is. And that's not pleasing to God. So that the priest offer the Mass with a false Pope is sacrilegious. Nor, so let me summarize what I have said. First, Vatican II is either Catholic or it is not. Second, if it is Catholic, then certain conclusions necessarily follow. If it is not Catholic, then certain conclusions necessarily follow. But it is not Catholic. Therefore, Sedevacantism necessarily and logically follows. The position of the Society of St. Pius X is impossible, and opinionism is not an option. Thank you for listening.
Antonio from Lake Buzzards. My Lord, if a priest is not a priest of the Resistance now, you just don't know whether their name is in the canon or not, and Bishop Williamson is one of them. In fact, I tried listening to CFE, but I can't hear. Even serving the Mass, I cannot even hear when he says the agency. Then how should I go on that if I do?
Should ask him. Do you mention Bergoglio in the canon or the local bishop?
Just asking that right.
Yes. You have a right to know, just as a doctor has to put up on his wall his credentials. It's not an embarrassing thing to ask a doctor, where did you go to school and are you licensed to practice? You have absolutely the right and the obligation to know.
Just as I do to say, ask a priest or a bishop who ordained you, the same right.
Absolutely. It should be public knowledge. And if a priest has any embarrassment about answering, or if he is in any way dodging the question, then there's something seriously wrong about the priest. He should be clear. If he says, I am in communion, and I do mention his name, he should be clear about it. If he says, I am not, he should be clear. You have a right to know. It concerns everything, as we said. It's all connected. So just ask. Say, do you mention him in the canon? And it should be public knowledge as well, just as the credentials of a physician should be public knowledge. He can't say, well, I don't, but don't tell anybody. You have every right to tell everybody. Whether he doesn't want you to do it or not, you have a right and an obligation to say he is in communion or he is not, with the Novus Ordo hierarchy. That is, again, part of the definition of Catholicism in this case.
Some of the arguments that I've heard against, say it, Sedevacantism canons, that Sedevacantism go to society and whatnot, is that you don't necessarily agree with every single error. The priest might make one or two error, and you're not necessarily consenting to the whole thing.
Well, that he might be in error about something, that something that does not affect your relationship to the Roman Pontiff. Yes, that does not, that can be tolerated, that he might be in error about, something that doesn't affect you. But his relationship to the Novus Ordo hierarchy does affect you because it involves your sacrifice to God, your act of worship.
I'm thinking about tomorrow, my Lord, about going to Bishop Williamson's Mass and, wherever, if I ask
He's
him
going to come. He's going to come as he offers the Mass in union with Bergoglio.
He's been speaking out against Bergoglio, and I think he's kind of thinks Ratzinger might be the Pope, but he may have Ratzinger's name, Bergoglio's name, or no name.
Ratzinger doesn't help us. He's part of Vatican II. The whole thing goes back to Vatican II. It's not this personality or that personality. The whole thing goes back to Vatican II. If they are promoting Vatican II, then, and we're saying Vatican II is substantial distortion, then they cannot be popes.
Very much for Lord.
Yes.
2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned the gospel of St. Paul, if an angel from heaven preached the gospel. So
The epistle of St. Paul.
The epistle of St. Paul. What are the conditions of the gospel in terms of Catholic? Basically, has a Novus Ordo explicitly taught against Catholic doctrine? That's the first question.
Yes.
And the second is, what are the true conditions for a pope to be a true pope in canon law or whatever the highest supreme governing law of the church would be? And has the pope contravened these conditions?
All right, the first is there a contradiction of Catholic doctrine? Yes, you have ecumenism, that non-Catholic religions are means of salvation. That's contrary to outside of the church there is no salvation. And Pius IX said that is a most well-known Catholic dogma. And Vatican II teaches it, and John Paul II reiterated it in the Catechesi Tradendae in 1980. He said children must be taught that non-Catholic religions are means of salvation. It's a heresy.
It says that.
It's in the Catechesi Tradendae. You could look it up on the internet. That the children must be taught that. Religious liberty contradicts Pope Pius IX. The teaching of that people have a right to profess and propagate false religions. That is contrary to the teaching of the Catholic Church. The new ecclesiology that the Church of Christ is something bigger and wider than the Catholic Church. That's the Lumen Gentium ecclesiology. That has been condemned by many popes. The collegiality, which destroys the hierarchical constitution of the Catholic Church, and gives power to the body of bishops as something, as a power different from that of the Roman Pontiff, as if there are 2 heads. So that's something. It was invented in the 18th century by somebody called Febronius. The Gallicans and all. It's an old heresy. But those are the main points. But there are many other points too.
Just to clarify on that, is that in terms of canon law, would the canon law itself see those as, I suppose, infallible, and therefore if they teach this, say, infallibly, there's the error? Or is it just being promulgated in a council, which they say is pastoral and nothing else?
Okay, that's not true, but go
ahead. So basically, is the error that they say all these things, the big error, or is it that these things actually, what they do say, does contravene the highest law of the church, and therefore, if they say it, they take themselves outside of it? That's good.
Well, yes, you have a council that is solemnly convened, and although one of its purposes was pastoral, as John the 23rd said, he did not in any way exclude any definitions. He talked about the teaching of Catholic doctrine in it. And Paul VI, in 1965, spoke of the extraordinary magisterium of the council. So there is no doubt that it had a dogmatic purpose. There were 2 constitutions that were called dogmatic. I mean, that idea that it's only pastoral was something invented by the Society of St. Pius X in order to let Vatican II pass, that we can essentially ignore all of it because it was only pastoral and therefore has no authority whatsoever. It does have authority. You couldn't get the Pope and the bishops coming together, the whole Catholic hierarchy coming together, and not say something that is binding on the consciences of the faithful. You can't get a higher authority than the Pope speaking with the entire Catholic hierarchy on a dogmatic issue. It doesn't get any better than that. That's supreme. And if you read the final texts of Vatican II, it says, we say these things in the Holy Ghost, and we command them to be promulgated to the whole church. It is impossible that they come together and not teach, because that is the whole teaching church there. It's against the nature of the Catholic Church that they not teach. If they didn't intend to teach, then it's something like a golf outing or some sort of recreational activity, like judges on the golf course might say, I think this man is guilty or I think he's innocent. That is non-binding teaching, obviously, on their part. So you would have to reduce Vatican II to some informal meeting of bishops where they're just talking and gabbing, and it's certainly not that. And you have Paul VI talking about the extraordinary magisterium. That means infallible, extraordinary magisterium. And I can give you that reference if you want. He said it shortly before the end of the council. Then when the council became unpopular, after it was promulgated, he backed up on it. And he said, well, the council only wanted to make ordinary magisterium. But the ordinary magisterium is also infallible. The universal ordinary magisterium is infallible. It's in canon law. So, but he can't back up on it. Pius XII couldn't promulgate the Assumption of the Virgin Mary and then say, well, I really didn't mean to make an extraordinary statement. Once it goes out, once the horse is out of the barn, that's it. The consciences are bound, and that's it. He is even bound by it. So you can see that the mind of Paul VI in promulgating Vatican II was extraordinary magisterium. I have the text from the actual official Vatican documents of the time. I could send it to you if you want. Yellow, where it says it. It's in Latin, though, but I could translate it for you. It's that idea that it was merely pastoral and it can be ignored is a fiction of the Society of St. Pius X. And canon law is silent concerning election of popes. It says nothing about it. The election of popes is determined by documents outside of canon law. At least I am not contesting election as such, because I would say that there has been no discontinuity in the elective processes of the Catholic Church. They have not broken from that. It is not like the Church of England, which got excommunicated and is on its own and is off, It has continuity with the past as an organization, but it has no authority. The nature of authority is that you get a legitimate designation for authority from below, that is from the church, and then from above you get the authority of Christ. When those two things come together, you have a pope. Now, ordinarily they come together fine because there are no obstacles to their coming together. But an obstacle would be that you intend to foist upon the Catholic Church something that is contrary to her nature, such as false doctrines and false liturgy. That would be an obstacle, because the purpose of authority is to ensure the common good of the organization over which the authority is set. So, for example, you have a perfect example in the President of the United States. He is elected in November. He doesn't achieve the power until January. before modern transportation, it used to be march. Carriages and so forth. The United States was so big that in the 18th century it took a month to go from New York to Washington. The roads were horrible and everything. So they made that gap between the election and the actual achievement of the power in Washington. So you have 2 months now in which there is a president-elect who has no power. He has absolutely no power. The incumbent president remains the president until January 20th. Then the new president comes in. He must swear before the entire world that he will uphold the Constitution of the United States. If he does not swear, he is not the president. I'll give you an example. Obama messed it up in his first inauguration. He got the words mixed up or something. People caught it. Of course, the whole world was watching him. People caught it. The Chief Justice of the United States had to go to him the next day at the White House and redo it, lest anyone say that he did it wrong. That's how important it is that the person pledge to uphold the common good in order to achieve the authority. And that is true of police. It's true in any country. Of soldiers, it's true of, in our country, senators and representatives in Congress. It's probably true in this country too. You must swear to uphold those things. Doctors must swear to do what they are supposed to do. And so the point is that you must pledge yourself to the common good of the organization or the role you have, over which you are set by authority. Otherwise, you cannot obtain the authority. If, therefore, you intend something which is necessarily and essentially contrary to the common good, you cannot attain the authority. That's what we're saying about these conciliar popes. It'd be like a captain of a ship who intended to run the ship against rocks. What would the crew do? They would lock him up in the brig. That's what they would do. They'd say, we have, or a general who wanted to hand over his army to the enemy. What would they do? I mean, this might be not a very politic thing to bring up in Great Britain, but Benedict Arnold. He was an American general who was really responsible for the victory at Saratoga, which was the turning point of the War of American Independence. Saratoga over Burgoyne, who was a great British general. He was responsible for that, and because he was disgruntled that he did not achieve recognition, he decided to go over to the British. Well, as soon as they found out about that, as soon as the Continental Army found out about that, I mean, that was the end of him, and there was no trial or anything. That was just the end of his authority. Because how can you lead the Continental Army if you are in league with our enemies? That was, I'm just giving that as an example. As I said, this is probably not the best place to give that example. But it is a good example. That if you do not intend the essential good of the organization over which you're set, you cannot obtain the authority. So it all goes back to that original question, is Vatican II Roman Catholicism or not? It all goes back to that.
You know, Your Excellency, people who are watching this and they have their own questions, in your experience through many years of dealing with this, when you find that you can make compelling arguments to people, what do you find is the major thing that holds them back from accepting these conclusions? What is the fear that is driving?
I think they see Sedevacantism as something radical and bizarre and off the wall, as I don't know if you say that in England, but it's something that is just too far, too much off the mainstream. I would respond to that in this way, that the problem that we have in the church is bizarre, it is off the wall, it is extreme. We've never had this problem before of a complete destruction of Catholicism practically everywhere, of a Hiroshima of Catholicism from the time of 1958. where everything is leveled. We've never seen that, and therefore the theological conclusions concerning it are not going to be mainstream. They're going to be as extreme as the problem is extreme. And so, they have to, just as the people after the bomb in Hiroshima came out and looked at everything leveled, they have to take a good long look at what the condition of the Catholic Church is today, in comparison to 1958, when it was vibrant and full of vigor and making conversions everywhere, in England especially. People were converting at a very high rate in this country. So that's, I'd say, the one thing, and also they don't understand it. They don't understand the connection of Sedevacantism to principles that they are really holding. The reason that they're not going to the Novus Ordo is because they think that they cannot save their souls in it, and that's true. They think of it as defection from the Catholic faith, and that's true. They do not see the connection, the logical connection of taking that position with the conclusion of Sedevacantism. And that's really the purpose of my conference today, is to show in a concise and essential way that logical connection.
Your Excellency, thank you for this. My name is Peter, I'm from Enfield. The problem I had, the question that was given just a moment ago was about extremism and so forth. And I think that's why many of those who go to the Anglican Mass is because they've told me themselves is that they see it as prudence. And what I've seen from my example, because I'm a Sedevacantist, and it's been years before I became a Sedevacantist, because I had to really see it through and then I saw the truth. My issue was about so many Sedevacantist groups where there seemed to be so much endless bickering, and they never seem to come to the same conclusion. And at times, that could maybe pull people back, I think, because they see it as somehow a bit of crackpots, a bit of crazy loonies and so forth. But I think the truth is, because they actually fear of actually maybe losing their loved ones or friends because of it, because once you've actually come to the conclusion that you're not such in a comfortable position, whereas the SSPX and other groups are, that seems to be holding them back. And for me, I think sometimes our faith should always come first. And this is where obedience, there's always a question about obedience of faith, and I think our faith should obviously push us back. Again, the question really, or statement I want to make really, is it's not so much about the traditional Latin Mass. I think, as you've explained very well, it's about doctrine. And I think that's what many people have missed out, because many don't really understand the dogmas of the Church, or what the Church officially has taught. I found out, a few people have told me, that the SSPX teach some sort of doctrine called invincible ignorance. And I've read a little bit about it, and somehow, not only is it erroneous, it actually verges on heresy somehow. I don't know what your experience on invincible ignorance is, and maybe you can explain a bit about that, and what differs from Sedevacantists and Anglican Mass folk, if it makes a bit of sense.
Well, there is such a thing as invincible ignorance. All moral theologians speak about invincible ignorance. It simply means ignorance that cannot be overcome by normal means. That's the definition of it. So, for example, a farmer that cannot read and who's never been to catechism class could easily be in invincible ignorance of certain dogmas of the Catholic faith. St. Bernadette was in invincible ignorance of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, because she came back to the priests and said that the name that the lady gave was the Immaculate Conception, and she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." She didn't know what the Immaculate Conception was. And the priests were very shocked because she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And they knew that no ordinary person, not even a priest, could come up with that. "I am the Immaculate Conception." So she was in invincible ignorance of that. That is a guiltless ignorance, because there is no possible way within normal human possibilities to know. And it varies from person to person and state to state of various peoples and conditions. So what might be in a very highly developed country, knowable by everybody, may not be knowable by people who live in less developed countries, and so forth. So there is, and it excuses from a guilt of sin if it is invincible ignorance. It is opposed to what is known as vincible ignorance or culpable ignorance, which is a true ignorance. You don't know, but you could resolve it fairly easily. For example, the example given by moral theologians is a doctor who is supposed to amputate somebody's leg, and he thinks, I don't know which leg I'm supposed to take off. I think it's this one. See, he doesn't know, and he doesn't mean any harm. But through his ignorance, he causes harm. Let's say he takes off the wrong one. He causes harm through his ignorance, and his ignorance is culpable. No court would say, well, you didn't know, and it was through no fault of your own that you cut off the wrong leg, and so we let you go. He'd probably get his license taken away from him, and he would be sued for millions of pounds. And so that's known as vincible ignorance, and some people are in culpable or vincible ignorance. So there's nothing non-Catholic about that distinction. It's just how you apply it might be another thing.
Are there any more questions?
One last one.
Sure.
What can we do for those who still attend the Unicum Mass but are Sedevacantists, but we have no Mass to go to? What would you recommend, Bishop?
Well, we have to stir up the English people. England has never been warm to our stirrings, let's put it that way. There's for example, even today, there are very few people here today, even though we sent out a lot of publicity about this talk. There seems to be a certain lethargy in this country with regard to doing what ought to be done. The way you get a priest is by saying, look, we absolutely want a priest. We are willing to pool our resources in order to obtain a priest, to support him. He can travel around the country to various groups, and we'll do whatever is necessary. But you need some enthusiasm for that, and some commitment. We can't do it on our own, and so that's what we need to hear from the English people, is that yes, we see the problem. We see that we need priests who are not in any way connected to the Novus Ordo and don't want to be connected to the Novus Ordo, and we want their masses. We want to sort of straighten out our reaction to Vatican II. That's what we need to hear, and if we hear that, we will send a priest. But that's partially my purpose. Now I'm going up to. I'll be speaking again tomorrow in Durham, and so we'll see the reaction as time goes on. But so as I said at the beginning, Bergoglio is bringing out a lot of people right now that Ratzinger did not. Ratzinger put on nice vestments and rented the traditional mass, and he was sort of a hero to certain what we call Novus Ordo conservatives. But Bergoglio has turned off everybody. It's just. I even got an email. Did you see the email I sent you? I even got an email that some of the Fraternity of St. Peter priests are tending towards Sedevacantism, and that their superior is saying, "Don't jump ship," and making statements that would indicate that he's concerned about a tendency towards Sedevacantism among the Fraternity of St. Peter, because with that suppression, that severe action that they took with the Congregation of the Immaculata, everybody in that motu proprio world is just shivering right now. They're just like, what is coming down? They're very concerned about it, and he's very unpopular with that.
My Lord, you went to Ricone, did you, or was it Renone?
Went to Icone.
Okay.
I'm as old as dirt.
And when you were a priest, this side St. Pius X, did you always say Mass non unicum, or did you say it unicum and then say it non unicum?
I said it first non unicum, Then in 1980, when Archbishop Lefebvre was very insistent that everybody be Una Cum, because I was an opinionist at that time, I said, all right, I'll say Una Cum. See what opinionism does. Because you can go either way. So because he said, I really want this, I think this is necessary, for a few years, I was Una Cum. But then, as time went on, remember what we said before, as time went on, you think about things, I realized that what I'm saying here was true, that the whole thing is compacted together logically, that if you're saying Vatican II is defection, then you have to conclude necessarily that he's not the Pope. And since then I've been non-Una Cum and a very firm Sedevacantism. But opinionism is very dangerous, because it reduces something that pertains to the definition of our Catholicism to a mere opinion. It cannot be.
To circle back to the gentleman's question, Your Excellency, is it, when you say how are we supposed to go to Mass if we don't have access to non-Una Cum priests, is that not misplacing the priority, that the issue isn't whether I can get to Mass, but whether I'm keeping the Catholic faith?
Yes, we can live without the Mass, but we can't live without the faith. The Japanese lived without the Mass for years, but they kept their faith going by the Holy Rosary. And so that's something that must be underlined, is that the first consideration is dogma, and the first consideration is fidelity to the Catholic faith, come what may. That even if I go to Mass once a year or twice a year, well then so be it, as long as that is a Catholic Mass, said by a priest that is not connected to the Novus Ordo hierarchy, or does not want to be connected to the Novus Ordo hierarchy, in which the awful name of Bergoglio is not mentioned in his Mass. That is, you go to Mass to please God, not to please yourself. And you have to find a Mass that is pleasing to God. Come what may. Yes?
Your Excellency, would an apt analog be if you lived in a French town during the time of the Revolution and all you had in town was a jurying priest as opposed to a non-jurying priest, that you would just have to not go to Mass? Or not even have your children baptized, according to the Pope?
Yes, Pius VI said that you could not even bring your children to be baptized by the constitutional priests in the French Revolution. You could have nothing to do with that. So the same is true in these times. Now, in the times of the French Revolution, you had your ox cart, or perhaps if you had some money, you had a horse, but it would take you an hour to go a few miles. So in a place like France, which is a big country, you could easily have been deprived of the Mass entirely if you did not have or know about a non-constitutional priest, because many times they had to hide, just as the priests in England did during the 17th century and 18th century. Bishop Challoner used to have something called a beer mass in the 18th century, where they would go to a tavern or pub, and everyone would have a beer here. They would say the Mass, and if the police came, the Mass was shut down, and they would take the beer out, and the police would arrive, and everyone was sipping a beer. And those are known as beer masses. And Bishop Challoner, as late as the 1750s, Catholicism was outlawed in this country. It was only really under George III where it started. He was totally against permitting it, but it started under George III. One of the reasons was that England accepted 5,000, not less than 5,000 emigre priests from France. And so Catholicism became a little bit more accepted here. Also, the Pope refused to close the port of Ancona and Civitavecchia to English ships, because he said to Napoleon, the English king has accepted 5,000 of our priests from France. I'm not going to close our ports to him. And, of course, that made Napoleon furious. But there started to be a little bit of a thaw with regard to Catholicism in England. But, persecution and martyrdom is an essential part of Roman Catholicism. If we ever lose that spirit, we're dead. The Catholic faith and truth must prevail no matter what difficulties or problems we have, even death. If we lose that, we are dead ourselves in the faith. And we've had an easy time for the past century or so, most of us, especially in Western countries. But these are not easy times. They are very bad times, and we must preserve our faith no matter what it takes.
One of the many, when discussing Sedevacantism, one of the many remarks is, why let it worry you? We don't know if the Pope is the Pope. Centuries ago, people wouldn't have known. When, say, Catholics in this country were under persecution, they may not have known. So why let it worry us? It's as long as we keep the faith, we don't know whether he's the Pope or not, and that will do. What sort of response?
I would respond by saying that if you know enough, and if you're certain that Vatican II is a departure and a substantial change of Roman Catholicism, then you do know enough to say that he isn't the Pope, because logically they're connected. Someone might have to point out the logical connection to you, which I hope I did today, but they are intimately connected, so that you could not say, really, without ignorance, that, well, we are adhering to the faith, we reject Vatican II, we reject the new Mass, but we don't know whether he's the Pope or not. That's impossible to say logically and theologically. They are intimately connected. So it would just be a question of explanation. Again, how do you know that the Vatican II is contrary to faith? Why are you reacting to it? Why are you seeking out the traditional Mass? By what principles? The same principles by which you're doing that dictate that you say he's not the Pope. That's what I
Lord, touching on that question, say in the Great Western Schism in medieval Europe, you were a traveller, you were travelling around Europe, and of course different areas of Europe, very different people were popes, and you didn't have enough of that local language to speak to the local priest to ask him, you know, who do you put in your canon. Then in those times, presumably, what would you have done about, what would some of those times do about that?
Well, first of all, they are not analogical times, because there was no question of doctrine there. There was a question of election. All of the anti-popes of Catholic history have been over election. If somebody was a false pope, it was because of election, not because of doctrine. I'll give you a single exception to that in a minute. But so it was you were not in any way compromising. If you were to say, well, in Italy, the Roman Pope is the Pope here, you were not in any way compromising your Catholic faith by recognizing the Roman election. And you were not compromising the Catholic faith by recognizing the French election. So you could say, well, you know, there's a doubtful election. It's possible that one or the other is the Pope. And that has to be resolved by ultimately the authority of the Catholic Church, and I'm submitted to that authority. There's no question of doctrine there, and of going to a false religion or anything like that. So the analogy doesn't hold, I don't think. It just, it's apples and oranges. Here you have a clear break from Catholicism, and it involves an act against the first commandment. See, to say, I don't know if the Roman Pope or the Avignon Pope is the true Pope, I don't know which one it is, that you could say because it's only an election.
Would you go as far as to say that the SSPX and the SSPX resistance are false religions? Because they are religion of doctrine about Begonia.
False. I wouldn't call them religions. I would say they have false positions that cannot be espoused by any Catholic. I would say that their positions concerning resistance to Vatican II are deeply false and dangerous and should not be espoused by any Catholic. The only proper response to saying that Vatican II is essential distortion, a substantial change, is to say that he is not the Roman Pope. It's impossible that substantial change come from the authority of Christ. which is vested in the Roman Pontiff. It's impossible. Otherwise, you essentially trash the Catholic Church. It's like the Church of England. You might as well go off to the Church of England. It's just a group of people, investments that are saying what they think, and it has no assistance from God.
You might as well just just go on eBay, buy investments, buy this, and that.
Well, the essence of Catholicism is that it is an ecclesiastical organization, a church founded by Christ with the assistance of Christ to the hierarchy until the end of time. That gives it its whole purpose and license and ability to direct men what to do and what to think. You take that out, what do you have? You have a Church of England. You just have a group of ecclesiastics, people running around investments in cassocks. That's all you have. Pretty buildings. As Father Cicada says, great music and no confessions. That's the Church of England.
You get women in cassocks if you're under.
Yes, I was up in York, and there were women priests all over the place. And I was just saying to someone yesterday, all right, the Church of England, it is heretical. You see a Church of England priest or minister in a cassock. All right, he's a heretic, but he's not absurd. But when you see a woman in a cassock, a woman with a chasuble on, that's absurd. I mean, they just reduce themselves to total absurdity by doing that. And not once. I went to Durham, I went to York, I went to Lincoln, and I went to St. Paul's yesterday here. I did not see a single young Anglican male priest. Plenty of females, but not a single young man that was an Anglican priest. Not one, and those are in York. It's like, after Canterbury, York is it. And I thought, this is like a Second Vatican for them. And it was full of women. The whole place was full of women. Practically young girls. They looked like they were about 20 years old. Young girls walking around in cassocks. I mean, it was so absurd. And then this old woman, put on a chasuble and gave out communion. And then she was helped by some old man, some ancient man who was an Anglican priest. And she's got her chasuble on, she's doing a communion service, a recital. I thought, oh my goodness. I mean, this is just the pits of absurdity. How anyone can take this seriously. It's just beyond me. And here, these magnificent buildings that were built for the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and for Catholic truth, and by Catholic truth, by the truth that was in those people that built them. Buildings that just, I think they exceed the cathedrals of France as far as their beauty and their size and their power. And they're magnificent testaments to the minds of the medieval people in England and to the strength of their faith. That these sacred buildings are now housing the absurdity of girls running around in cassocks and old ladies saying Mass or saying their communion service. I mean, it is just, it turns your stomach. It's just awful.
We have time for more questions?
Sure, yes.
And Your Excellency, and as a Sedevacantist, the sort of questions or those who are opposed to Sedevacantists, so-called family and friends, they always seem to say, oh, but Peter, you can't be a Sedevacantist because the gates of hell shall not fail. But what's your understanding of the gates of hell? Because as I look at it, it's not just only about a building, as you've made clear. The Catholic Church has to be your faith. Can you actually explain what that means and what sort of answer I can give to family and friends?
The gates of hell, that's a Hebraism for the power of the devil. And that the word prevail is used means that it's going to try. The devil is going to bang at the doors and do everything he can. And I think that, there's two ways to bring down the Catholic Church. One is by a frontal assault, which happened in the persecutions and the heresies. The other is by an attempt to transform it. If you denature something or take away its essence, you have succeeded in destroying it. And so that's the other path, and it's the more effective path. I mean, Henry VIII, if you put all of the heretics of the 16th century together, they didn't do as much damage to the church as John the 23rd did. If you put all of them together, Arius, Nestorius, they did not do as much damage to the Catholic Church as the modernists, because there has been an interior transformation of Catholicism, and it's like a poison. I'm sure you have them in this country. When you have ants in your home, you get these little things that you put out near the ants, these little plastic things, where the ants come in and take the poison, and they bring it back to their anthill, and the queen is poisoned, and then the whole anthill is gone. I'm sure you know. That's essentially what has happened. The whole anthill has died because of this poison that has been spread around everywhere. So that's the gates of hell. I mean, I would respond again. Well, is Vatican II substantially Catholic or non-Catholic? All right. If it's substantially Catholic, then go blow up your balloons. Put on your clown suits. Get with it. If it is substantially non-Catholic, then the way that the gates of hell will not prevail is by the resistance and the total resistance of Catholics to this heresy, and not by some half-baked resistance that is neither nor, and tries to straddle between Novus Ordo and traditional. That's not going to do anything against the gates of hell. We have to fight fire with fire. That's what I would respond to. All goes back to that original question. Is it Catholic or not? Can you save your soul in the Novus Ordo? That's it. We're all going to die, and we're going to go someplace. If I can get on the Novus Ordo bus and go to heaven, I'm taking it. It'll be a lot easier, a lot less expensive. Everything would be easier.
You wouldn't have to build seminaries from scratch.
Right.
And I was using that cartoon thing, Modernville, Vatican II bus lines. Hey, got anyone on this? SSPX? Maybe not.
I haven't seen that. No, I haven't seen that. But, the truth can never be in straddling. Truth is always yes or no, or black and white. Yay, yay. Nay, nay.